So, welcome back to our last session today, and tonight it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to Professor David Edwards from Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. David Edwards is Gordon McKay Professor of the Practice of Biomedical Engineering in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Harvard University. He's founding faculty of the Wyss Institute of Biologically Inspired Engineering. Nice term. He's also founder of Le Laboratoire, a cultural center in Paris and Cambridge, where artists and designers perform experiments at frontiers of science. David works also with contemporary artists, designers, chefs, perfumers, and other creators to pioneer research around ambiguous questions in human health, society, and the environment. And although this is a keynote lecture, we agreed upon having a discussion afterwards. So we will have a talk over 45 minutes, and then we have the chance to discuss questions related to David's paper and contribution tonight, which has the title Culture Acts as Experimentation and Change. So thanks for coming from America, and the applause is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm really delighted to be here. Actually, I'm now a professor of idea translation, whatever that means, but my role at Harvard has evolved a lot over the last 15 years, and will be sort of charted by this presentation. So given the nature of the colloquium and the nature of my work today, I'd like to talk pretty broadly and begin with this notion of the laboratory, the laboratoire in my particular case. Clearly, we all have an understanding of the importance of labs today in driving culture in a certain way. We think generally of labs as being a context for a certain kind of experimentation, and notably one where we have a pretty perfect understanding of constraints. We have a system whose laws are pretty well, if not perfectly well, understood. We perturb those systems and look at behavior, and we make deductions of what that behavior means in terms of the nature of that system. Unfortunately, science doesn't work really like that. Particularly, it doesn't work like that at frontiers. Generally, we're working with systems, particularly at frontiers, where we don't know all the constraints, where we don't understand precisely the laws that govern the system. And therefore, where intuition and induction plays a much bigger role than actually we talk about. I'm going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about what the lab means today. But let me leap to this notion of culture, which we all have different, probably, views on. It's one of the most complicated words there is. In my context, I want to talk of culture as an embodiment of values and belief of a particular society. It could be the Society of Applied Mathematicians, it could be the Society of Zurich in 2016, whatever, but there's some collection of values and beliefs, and for a very long time in human history, the sort of timescale of cultural change was slow relative to the timescale of a human life, and so our cultural forms, what expressed our culture, tended to be pretty static and pretty explicitly representing those values and beliefs. To leap forward to America in 2013, one of the most significant works of contemporary art in the last few years was a work called Station to Station, where Doug Aiken, an LA-based artist, invited hundreds of artists onto a train, an Amtrak train, leaving from New York City, and traveled to San Francisco over several weeks. The train stopped in 10 to 15 different towns across America, and there were what Doug called happenings in each city that were really mixing audience, artist. He was really breaking down the notion of studio and museum, so everything was sort of an experiment, really, and it was highly resonant work of art, which seems to have nothing to do with the sarcophagus I just showed you. It's true that over the last several years, we have personalized culture, and so there's been a bigger understanding of the role of each of us in creating culture, and our own perceptions and experiences have shown up increasingly in cultural forms. So if we look at a work by Vermeer, one of his last works of the girl with a guitar, is clearly a very personal and yet in some way universal expression of the culture of Delft in the late 1600s. Move forward to Jackson Pollock making one of his abstract expressionist works in post-war New York, and the element of the experimental is again highly integrated into his personal work of art. Now, this notion of experimentation and ultimately of the lab as being relevant to artistic expression today became even more explicit in Andy Warhol's work. I see you've got some Polaroid images of Andy out here. And so he, as many of you probably know, opened the factory and ran the factory in New York City, which was an interesting borrowing of the science lab model. One of the most disruptive things about the science lab post-World War II is that it has not only been a place of experimentation, but it's also been a place of translation. So what we do actually, because of an infrastructure that's been built around scientific labs, can pretty quickly lead to mass-produced change. And that's primarily why we now are in a situation where 2 to 4% of GDP in developed countries is going to laboratory research, because there's been this model of translational research. And so Andy co-opted that and took the experimentation of the factory and mass-produced art and led to a real new vision of how art is really a partner with science in exploring the frontier. Now, actually, this notion of art being at home in the lab was explicitly the focus of Hans Ulrich Obrist's exhibit in Antwerp in 1999 called Laboratorium, in which labs around the city were opened up. Artists came into labs, and the public was invited into the labs to see the artistic work. And as Hans says in a conversation, this is probably the most important and popular contemporary art exhibit in the last 20 years that nobody went to. So it's actually, but there's a really great catalog, and it was actually a very pivotal moment in the contemporary art history. Now, over the last 10 or 15 years, increasingly, we've not only been introducing the experimental into contemporary art, obviously into contemporary science, but also inviting the public to participate. So that was inherent in the Doug Aiken station-to-station work, but a canonical work is that of Olafur Eliasson in 2004 in the Tate Modern called The Weather Project, where this big glowing sun was installed. And then it was an experiment, and it happened to be in 2004, and so we were all feeling a lot of angst for the elections in the United States, and so there was a lot of really funny, incredible sort of human experiments that happened as people laid on the ground under this sun and spelled out things that were very explicitly political, and it was kind of an amazing moment. And this, all of this is reflecting the obvious reality that life relative to life in Vermeer's day is so radically transformed by technology and consequences of technology that it's hard really for any of us to wake up and not feel like we're at a frontier. It's hard for anybody to go to school today and not sort of assume that the professor that is actually teaching them what it means to be a doctor or a lawyer or an artist or whomever doesn't really know what it means to be an artist or a lawyer or a doctor or whatever in 2030, because the world is just changing so radically. And so it has led to the frontier as having popular dramatic relevance, and this is being now transmitted to popular culture and certainly to art and design and science discourse. And ultimately, it connects to what are we doing at a university and how do we learn at a university? What does it mean to learn today, actually? And it's really hard to understand or believe that learning today does not connect to the experimental, whereas learning at the university for hundreds and hundreds of years has been connected to a transmission of information that is pretty privileged and pretty directly correlated to a world that we understand, or to domains that we understand. It is increasingly clear that the role of the university is changing, and that it's going to be connected to teaching students how to confront a world that's rapidly changing and observe and know what to do at the moment to bring benefit to the world that they're living in, which is essentially to be a great experimentalist, whatever that means. Now, years ago, my background is in applied math, and then I started some biotech companies, and therefore when I came to Harvard, I was in the biomedical space. I was, as many probably, had multiple interests, was very involved in writing and theater, and so I became interested in this notion that there was something bigger to do, and it led to me leaving the university. My wife is French, and so we moved the day after Bush was reelected, so you can imagine how we all feel right now, to France. And I opened the laboratoire in Paris in 2007. And the notion I had, and I wrote a book at the time, I was interested in the following thing, that there are experiments to do that are at the frontier of knowledge, that are so full of ambiguity, we can't do them properly in a normal science lab, that the vocabulary of those experiments is inevitably artistic, aesthetic forms, and that the audience is not our peer-reviewed audience, but is a public, and that we need to be in a public dialogue, in a cultural dialogue around these frontiers, and that we could create this lab to have a similar translational form, very much like the Bauhaus a century ago, where what we experimented on might actually translate into not only learning, but into works of art and design. So we then began so the formula, and what I would like to do now over the next 30 minutes or so, is cover a number of experiments that we've done and just kind of give you a sense of what it means to do these experiments and where they've gone, and then reflect on what it means about learning and change in culture today. So we began by entering into dialogue with various artists and designers, and as was said, chefs and others, and interested in finding artists who were interested in moving to a frontier. It's sort of hard today to come to a frontier and really be at the frontier. So many frontiers are portrayed by sort of science communication, and they're not really the frontier. And so how do you bring someone to the frontier and then do an experiment? I'm very open-minded about what that experiment would be. Now, all of these experiments ended up connecting to kinds of sustainability issues of our day. And so as you'll see, I'll contextualize all those experiments by something massive that's going on that is sort of hard to contain in a science lab, but is clearly related to the world that we're moving into. One of the projects related to this notion of urban sprawl and urban architecture, and there's something sort of ludicrous about the idea that we're in such an evolutionary world right now, where anything we make, even something as mass commercial as a phone, is evolving constantly. And so Yahoo or Google or whatever today is not at all what it was a few years ago, partly because it's in a big public dialogue and it's changing it. And yet architecture has not really adapted the adaptability that you actually see in ghetto kinds of environments, where you sort of see this very ant-like sort of organic movement. And so we did a project with François Roche, wherein François Roche did a project where he explored this notion of a kind of architecture, organic architecture, that is using robotic elements and is deriving biomimetic information from inhabitants and creating forms and decreating forms, and so it was a real futurist sort of view that's kind of playing out in other contexts today. Really interested in food and in the future of the food system, which is we need to change consumer behavior radically to have a sustainable food system. And this notion that maybe we could make or design packaged food like nature packages fruit. And so this notion of having an edible skin and a biodegradable shell, the best bottle we have, could we design that? And so it led to an exhibition around what we called the cellular bottle, really, and ultimately this has now gone on to become a new food form that is called Incredible Foods, and basically for a few years we created a little food lab in Paris and began to make these food forms and kind of in a very sort of underground way, literally underground way. We're inviting people in and giving them food, including all these strange food forms. And it led to Pierre Hermé coming in one day, and we gave him a Black Forest torte. And so he's from Strasbourg, and so it was like the ultimate test. And so he kind of liked his Black Forest torte, wiki food, as we called it at the time. And this now, so the technology has really moved on and is in 3,000 stores in the United States and is really growing. And so there are little ice cream forms, and you can make any fruit in the form of a grape. And these are yogurt you can make in the form of a grape. And these things really are skins. They will be stable for a couple months. And then it's all natural. And so this kind of experimentation would have not been possible in my lab, but was something that the culture of Paris and ultimately culture picked up for many years until it could become a real reality. We, in 2009, began to work with the artist Shiva Gupta, who is based in Mumbai and is really interested in political kinds of issues. And she was interested in exploring this notion of political terror and where does it come from. And introduced her to Mahzarin Banerjee, who's a professor at Harvard and well known for her exploration of the subconscious mind and its role in our behavior. And what was really traumatic about this was that just 2 months before we did the exhibit, the Mumbai terror attacks happened, and so she was in. So there was an incredible drama around the project, and it led to this work a couple months later called Singing Cloud, with 10,000 microphones and the voice of Shilpa and other sounds kind of running around this, and kind of almost a metaphorical subconscious mind of the voiceless majority, and it was just super moving work that is now in the Louisiana Museum outside of Copenhagen, and so another kind of translation on a purely cultural dialogue. Really interested in the notion that we have evolved in circumstances of deprivation, really, and so we have survived by, among other things, eating whatever is available, and so suddenly in an era where we're in relative affluence, we have food forms that have been made to be accessible and pretty cheap and pretty tasty, and on the whole, pretty bad for us, and we're eating too much of it just because we kind of grew up that way. And so we became interested in, well, could we sort of hack the senses? And with Marc Bretillot, a food designer, created a object called the WAF, in which you can put any liquid, tomato soup or a martini or whatever, and it creates a cloud. So these are real little droplets of whatever that is that will fall into a glass, and that you can then sip out, and it's about 50 micrograms, and so it's an amazing, gustatory head experience. It's delivering sensation. So if you think about a food drug administration, there's a third thing that we're getting when we take food and drugs. It's sensations. So very often we're looking for sensations, and we're getting calories. We're looking for sensations. We're getting addicted. And what we really want is the sensation, and we don't really need all that other stuff. And so could you deliver sensations with essentially no food or medical drug? And so this was a very abstract. You can imagine the exhibition. People were, wow, this is really interesting. What do we do with this exactly? And so this, however, has been one of the amazing sort of adventures. This has gone on to be really picked up by the culinary world. And it is now some of the top chefs and baristas and so forth use it. But there was particularly last year, Ardbeg whiskey had their 200th year anniversary. And it's really hard when you're like Ardbeg whiskey. Like, what does it mean to be like entering the 21st century? And so we made a special design for them. So I'm going to show you just a little 1-minute video which gives you a sense of how something so abstract and cultural can translate into something sort of surprising. Actually, but anyway, the basic idea that all these people could be experiencing scotch and not really getting any alcohol in their blood was really interesting. This and other things led us to create a cafe. So we, one of the things that is really precious in a world that's changing radically is dialogue, and a dialogue that's sort of disinterested and that is honest. Which, of course, the internet has given us, and that's one of the reasons why it's been such a dramatic agent for change. But how do we create that kind of dialogue outside of sort of the digital realm, and particularly when there are no more town squares? And so where does that happen? So it's as you know, it's increasingly happening around food. So food is becoming a little bit the internet of our time. And so we created a place called Cafe Art Science where we do experiments and eat. And so that's where a lot of our ideas kind of percolate. So became interested in this. Well, I do work in Africa and went to see William Kentridge, who's a fascinating contemporary artist living in Johannesburg, and asked him if he would be interested in doing an experiment. So he was interested in time, and this notion that time and this notion of now, which of course has deep historic roots, that question, but it really has a new sense given all that's happening to our lives today. And so it led to a work called Rivers of Time, which was exhibited at the Laboratoire several years ago, and now has gone on as an opera and is traveling around the world in a collaboration between William and Peter Gallison, and this really exploring this idea of does now exist from a relativistic point of view, and then a very contemporary point of view. So that's again another cultural translation. Just a few more ideas here. One, many of you probably spend a lot of time in the sea, and as all of us kind of fascinated by the fact that there's so many jellyfish. And a book came out a few years ago by Lisa Ann Gershwin called Stung, and it was highly reviewed by the New York Times, doing book review. And so I called Mark Dion, who's a really talented contemporary artist in New York, and asked if he'd be interested in doing an experiment on jellyfish. He was fascinated to do that, and so we had my students kind of get involved. He got involved, and we ended up with Lisa diving in the Mediterranean with jellyfish. And it led to an exhibit called The Trouble with Jellyfish that now has moved on to the National Academies, and this is Mark with members of the National Academies in just a month or so ago in California. And these are moon jellies floating back here. And it was sort of really interesting because this is, again, a situation where there's a real alarm about the proliferation of jellyfish given overfishing, heating of the environment, and pollution. And yet, it's not like we've been counting jellyfish for the last 50 years, and so there's quite a scientific community. We don't think it's really happening. So it's a little bit where global warming was 15 years ago. And so pioneering research today inevitably is confronting this. Well, it seems like something's happening. It sort of intuitively seems like it. And so to bring this into the National Academies led to quite a conversation and, again, a sensibilization of the fact that we need to be moving into this sort of ambiguous zone where art really is the language. Again, in the work in Africa, I went there initially in a global health context, became interested in plastic, partly because of this sort of scene, and then water. And so we had a project with Mathieu Laneur, the designer, thinking about could you make a water gourd that kind of functioned like a biological cell, and so it could grow and shrink and have various utilities in a transport mode in Africa or the developing world. And it led to a project which then is being used in a community in northern South Africa, and another example of a kind of a translation. So last, I'd like to talk about an idea that is something I'm deeply involved in right now. So as we have moved to a immersion in a digital experience, among all the other things going on in society, there has been, as we all know, a real growth in wellness issues and anxiety and depression, and obviously there's lots of different things going on there. We decided to do an experiment around scent. So I'm really interested in the air. As you can probably tell, I've done lots of things just related to health delivery through the air. So since the Nobel Prize in 2004 for understanding the biology of olfaction, there's been a growing awareness in medical science of the importance of smell to our health and wellness. Even though it's a secondary and we're often not aware of it, it has an important impact on our biology and cognitive processes. And so we began to explore, initially actually in the context of coffee, this notion of virtual coffee initially, and working with some great coffee masters in Australia, which is where a lot of them are right now. It led to an experiment with Daniel Biro, who's a Hungarian-born composer, experimental composer, really interested in historic memory and scent. Just a lot to say about scent, but just one of the incredible things, experiments recently done. Animals, it turns out to be mice, subjected to some traumatic experience where scent is involved. And of course, every time they smell that, they're totally frightened. But not only is that group frightened, but their progeny, the next generation is frightened by that scent. And so there's this kind of Lamarckian kind of observation that is among the many mysteries that we're kind of trying to figure out about scent. But we did an exhibition around music and scent, and this was as we were beginning to explore this area, and it's led to something called Cyrano, which is a digital scent player or speaker, and O Notes, which is an app. It's kind of iTunes of scent, and you can download it for free on the Apple Store, and it allows you to play scent like you play music, and so scent will evolve over time. It's a very little personal experience. And we're actually doing a study in Germany, in Munich, in January, in a telemarketing company. So if you think about places where wellness is a real issue and where all of your senses are sort of occupied, but scent, it's like a telemarketing company. And so we're looking at how this player can improve productivity and satisfaction really at work. We're also, now if you get the app, you'll see that you can play your Spotify, and any music you choose, it will choose scents that match the mood of the music, and there's a lot of data now that shows that, of course, music affects your mood, scent affects your mood, music plus scent has that much more dramatic effect on your mood, so it's an enhancement of the mood of the music. So we're in a conversation with Spotify and Amazon and Apple, and so really looking at how do we bring this third dimension into digital communication, scent, and ideally have an impact on human wellness in different contexts. So all of this gets to learning, right? And so at the end of the day, pioneers are inveterate learners, right? We're just fascinated, super curious. And I was with David Debrulé, the major photographer, marine photographer of the National Geographic, at this conference in Los Angeles, and talking to him about his work. And he said, well, the key to being a great pioneer is just this. There's two things. One is passionate curiosity. And I said, well, what's the other? He said, kindness, actually, which is another thing, by the way, about frontiers. We don't really tolerate people who are not nice. There's so much at stake. But it's a fascinating context for learning. And so we have, as we've been building this, have been integrating learning with students and adults. And it's led to a growing program in Cambridge. Therefore, I brought the laboratoire it's now near MIT and in Cambridge and Harvard, and in leaving Paris, the Picasso Museum was just reopening, and Laurent Lebon, the new director, and so we began a conversation about a real preoccupation right now for me and for us is how do you raise the level of this kind of thinking to a global stage where it really addresses some of the urgent issues that we're all dealing with right now in the aftermath of our elections, and it's so many other things to say. So there's an urgency to confronting a world that's changing in a smart way, recognizing that we're all have different levels of experience and education. And so we came up with the idea of a new contemporary art prize called the Frontier Art Prize, kind of in the spirit of Pablo Picasso. And the National Academies have gotten involved, and others, and Harvard University, and so the first artist, this has not been announced yet, but is Doug Aitken, the guy who did the Station to Station experiment, and Kimberly is the head of that National Academies program. So she's coming to lead this effort, and it's not just a prize; there's also a new, what we're calling the World Frontiers Forum that will happen for the first time next fall. And Google and the Paul Allen Foundation and other cities are becoming involved, Harvard and the business school major involved. So what we're interested in is bringing leaders from government and corporations and culture around the world to experience frontiers, not really hear about them, but actually feel the risk and the excitement of being at a frontier, and to help drive learning. So I just say last few things before we open this up and talk. One of the probably the most resonant work of contemporary art of the last several years is a work called Rain Room. I don't know, have anybody seen Rain Room here? So It is, you can go to LA, LACMA, it is there right now. But Rain Room began at the Barbican in London several years ago, and a couple, they're German artists actually, they're called Random International, they're based in London, and we have now worked with them as well. This was not something that we were involved in. So it's very simple, and it's a room. It's a kind of a circular, semicircular room where it's raining, and as you walk into it, the rain doesn't hit you. So it kind of, you walk through the rain, you don't get wet. Of course, you can trick the system and end up getting wet, but generally, you don't get wet. So it has led to this international phenomenon. So wherever it goes now, there's lines that just go forever. It's gone to MoMA, it's gone to LACMA, it's China. Over 1 million people have kind of, and everywhere it goes, it leads to this major, of course, is this art, and what does this mean? In LA, because of the drought, it was something where parents were bringing their kids who'd been born and never seen the rain and kind of thrusting them into the water to try and get them wet. So it's led to lots of thinking about the environment. It's a real provocation in that we're kind of bringing nature into a very artificial setting, which is one of the major things happening today right now. There's this melding of the artificial and the natural. And so this is the kind of work today that culture is embracing, is experimental. But because of the nature of our lives today, the public is drawn to it. And so there's an opportunity, I think, for artists and scientists and designers in this intermediate space where we all kind of play together to have a massive public dialogue and affect change. So all of which is to say we can also eat really well, and so we should do that too. So thank you very much.
So we have a couple of minutes to do some question and responses. Who wants to start? In German or in English? Or my French is not so good. I mean, perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on the we. So you said we do this and we do that, and you talked about the experiments. But who's behind this? Who belongs to your team? Is this an institute?
Yeah.
Your students?
So in fact, this is a great question. So there's you can think of the lab as my lab, and so like any people who has a lab, you have a lot of people who are working in it, and yet it's also a lab where I invite others. So in the 23 experiments we've done, I've particularly been involved in maybe 10 of them, and so many of them I'm simply helping curate, and we have a team, which involves, it's a pretty small team and it changes, and they're pretty typical folks that you would find in a contemporary art production kind of studio gallery. What's more complicated and interesting is that there are then groups that include classes. So there's an educational program that's spun out of this that's called the Art Science Prize, and so there's groups in various cities and countries where kids are learning, and there are teams who are working with those kids. There's folks at Harvard University. Any one of these projects is highly collaborative, and I'm working on a new book and really emphasizing that it's kind of hard, for those of you who dive underwater. There's the notion of a buddy system. So it's really hard to go to a frontier and not have a buddy, right? And come back, actually, or even know what the hell to say. There's something about being at a frontier that is, having a company is a big deal. So everything we do is really collaborative. There are also startup companies. So when I, created the lab, which is not for profit, for a long time, it was actually being funded by these ideas spinning out, and then money going into those, and then those startups sort of funding the mother as a kind of an incubator. And so that there's a number of companies, the food company, the scent company, and there's another company in Hong Kong which is dealing with this sensory cloud stuff. So my own feeling, and this again I think gets back to the Bauhaus idea, is that at this frontier between art and science, everything should mix. So I think that the notion of having learning and having experimentation and having translation, whether it's cultural, commercial, should all coexist. And so it does. It's complicated, so it leads to all kinds of things where you have an idea that is initially in the realm of a pure education, and as that moves to an experimentation phase, there's a lot of nervousness. As that goes to a commercial or a cultural phase, there's nervousness. So I think if you look at a place like Silicon Valley or other environments where you, like New York with Broadway, off-Broadway, New York University, the key to a cultural cauldron, which is affecting change, is the coexistence of this learning, experimentation, and production. Kind of at Stanford University, Silicon Valley, and Apple, or New York University, off-Broadway, Broadway, where there's a common culture and there's sort of a trust in ideas. There's a real trust thing going on here that your idea is not going to be sort of stolen, and there's lots to be said there. So anyway, it's kind of a fragile collective thing.
Yeah. We were talking, oh yeah, here. True.
So experimentation usually takes time. Sometimes it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
What is, with respect to the experiments to which
Yes.
you have been alluding, just to get an idea,
Yeah.
are you
How
working
much time?
for a
Yeah.
year or
Yeah,
so on
good
a
question.
particular
Yeah.
project?
Yes, the question is how much time does it take to do experiments? So they range from and to be honest, just before I answer this fully, to be honest, the nature of these experiments, it's sort of hard to figure out where they begin and where they end, and so because I'm also driving this particular thing, like for example, the edible packaging thing, I had been thinking about this for a few years and had a conversation with Kenneth Snelson, a sculptor in New York, in December of 2009, called the designer in December 2009. We did the exhibit 9 months later. But there was enough intellectual kind of stuff going on between, that happens in academia too. There's things that are de novo, like the William Kentridge experiment. So it started with a conversation in Johannesburg, and he said, yeah, this sounds interesting. He was doing his Shostakovich opera months later in New York. Introduced him to Peter Gallison in the winter. It's interesting, but and then the Documenta was to happen the next year, and so Catherine, who was like the head of Documenta, she said, oh, that sounds interesting. Then William said, well, then maybe this is like a step towards Documenta, so I get it. So we did a workshop in June, another one in Johannesburg in November, and it showed in March. So a year and a half, but then another year, and it's been changing ever since, right? So what's really interesting for us, so it could be 2 years, could be a year, but because we're the advantage of being small and being is you can change pretty rapidly, and the world changes, and so we tend to be pretty focused. A couple year kind of time frame is probably right, but hopefully these are projects that continue to evolve.
Hi, I'm Andrea Bright from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and my question goes also a little bit to what you asked about the we, and it's more specifically about the curatorial. So it seems to me that you work with renowned artists, with stars, really. I mean, William Kentridge and all the others also. So how do you
curate, control the process, or
who is doing that, and who is? I mean, curating art is such a
profession,
it's such a difficult thing. Also, the art world is a difficult thing, and how do you
navigate
you
that?
As a scientist, as a mathematician, interact with there?
So interestingly, I have never called myself a curator, and I don't consider myself a curator, and I think that what is interesting why would a William Kentridge do an experiment with the laboratoire? So I think what's interesting to leading artists and designers, and we also work with younger people, I think is the so they're working with, this is a very non-conventional experimental opportunity, and so there's an opportunity to fail. There's an opportunity, and so the general answer is that with any given project, in William's case, he played a major role in, and I had a woman who worked with William, who came from the contemporary art world in Paris, and who was my producer. So I had a producer working, but in terms of the curation of the exhibit, he had played really the major role. In the Mark Diane exhibit that we did, Mark invited, I generally bring in a group of designers to help the artist kind of put their work together, and he invited my point of view, another point of view, but it is a real off-Broadway kind of thing that we're doing, and so we're really not looking to curate exhibits in a way that we would if we were doing it at the Institute of Contemporary Art. Although the projects, when they go on to the Institute of Contemporary Art, maybe we'll have a curator. So that's kind of the general answer. So I think that the interest from I know that the interest from the artist and designer point of view is a stepping out of the normal realm of contemporary art production, and this is not commercial. We don't need to drive a big audience. This is really an opportunity to do something new, and then to have access to scientists and issues that they would not otherwise have easy access to. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's kind of the answer.
Any other questions? So talking about transdisciplinary research or work is problem seeking rather. So you primarily talk about the fun part, but could you also talk about the
challenges,
the flip side?
Yeah.
So when the work does fail, or what kind of sort of epistemic or practical challenges, challenges would also be a very American term. So problems. Do you meet?
Yeah. So the biggest problem is sustainability. Doing what you want to do and not having a clear outcome. It's very hard to finance that, actually. And so every project has its own, like, this is not going to happen, and that there's some kind of savior kind of shows up or some way of making this thing happen. Because of the kinds of people we're dealing with, we can have, I remember my first exhibit I did, I had no experience with this, and it was Fabrice Hibert, who's very well known in France, and it was important for us to open with a French artist. And so Fabrice, we were to open the laboratoire, and we didn't even have approval yet to open, and it was like 3 days away, and he's in this cavernous kind of space, and I'm sitting there feeling, we're about there. And he says, you know what, I'd like to paint the floors like 3 different colors, and I'm saying, what am I going to say? No? It's just, okay, go ahead. And so it was the biggest toxic mess of this paint. Kind of, it was beautiful. The guy who was helping me do the construction said, this is going to be 20,000 euros to kind of clean this thing up. So it was a complete sort of disaster. But we couldn't really do anything about it. So there've been, moments like those. In terms of failure, I think that we have had projects that were better, conceived than other projects. I think the nature of a lab is you kind of never have a real failure in the sense, oh my gosh, it's not exactly, So we've had, honestly, probably the biggest failure we had was with Philippe Starck, the designer, and it's like you couldn't have a more famous designer, and he had approached us in Paris after we got going and said, let's do something, and so this would be amazing. We did this kind of cool project, and it actually was really not well received, and the reason was that Philippe was viewed as too commercial, and that this looked like a commercial for Philippe Starck, and so there was this kind of reaction to it. So and you learn something from that, but I would be telling a big lie if I were not to say that the laboratoire and finding sustainability of the laboratoire has been at times a nightmare, and you kind of wonder, why am I doing this? But it's obviously something I feel deeply about, and I think that, as I've been trying to say, I think there's a lot of contemporary resonance. Last thing I'll say is clearly I'm a dream seller, right? One of the things that you do when you're pioneering is you learn how to storytell, right? And so for sure, I tell a story. Now, if you're not, at 3 o'clock in the morning, do I wake up and do I not have that story in my head? No, I'm in that story. But it, for many of you, must sound like, oh my God, it can't really be that way. And I think that what happens with people who are doing this kind of thing is that they totally believe that that's what reality is, and they kind of do everything to kind of realize that reality. And their kids may hate them at moments, and things may not go perfectly well, but it's a story.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a question regarding one of the works you talked about, the work with the scent.
Yeah.
Because I work on a research project on cooking and eating as aesthetic practice, and I've just recently gotten into the field of scents and talked to perfumers, and I realized that, I learned to know that there hasn't been so much research yet on all the components of a scent. And that the problem is by using not natural scents, that they kind of are hard to, people react very differently to them, and also the intensity of the scent is very personally taken in, kind of.
Yeah.
So how did you work with that?
Yeah, so there's a lot to say, and I have the back in my hotel room. I can show you this, and you can play around a little bit with it. But basically, we work with, Christophe Damiel, who's an amazing, but also IFF. There's 3 major fragrance houses, basically 2 here in Switzerland and 1 in the United States. And so just to answer the question, the biology of olfaction, and we're still figuring it out. A lot is known about scent, and this whole issue of natural and artificial is pretty much, in general, a false one. And the main point is that if you've got the structure of a citrus molecule that's smelling like citrus, and you make it, it's exactly that same structure. It's not like it's got a stamp on it saying I'm artificial, right? It's exactly the same structure. Now, there may be other things in it, and it may be, then that's bad, right? And so the thing that's sort of toxic and bad about scent is the carrier. So scent is not allergenic, right? So scent cannot produce any kind of an allergic reaction. Now, proteins can and particles can, and so when you have scent with a candle, you have scent in a fragrance with a solvent, the solvent can be a problem, or the particle be a problem, but the molecule itself actually is the molecule itself, and so that, in general.
Yeah. I was actually referring to the intensity more, and
yes,
that people get headaches
from
non-natural scents.
Yeah.
I mean, just because the molecules are more simple than in nature.
Yeah, no.
Because a citrus scent is made out of probably 800 components.
Yeah.
And you cannot kind of replicate that.
Yeah, no, that's a more subtle question, totally. So now, let's come back to citrus. Citrus is not a single molecule, and moreover, this gets to our understanding of biology of scent. We don't really know why it is you smell chocolate, or why is it, and so it's not like we can take the molecule and look at the receptor and say, that's it. And as you say, it's often more complicated than so the issue of headaches and so on, I mean, I think it's important to separate issues. Number one, it's true that in creating the smell of cherry or the smell of, evening air, it's a simplification, and so there's one thing. A second thing is that our noses are all different. Okay, and so there is at any given moment 20% of the human population doesn't smell anything at all. It's anosmic, and then you in the morning are more sensitive to scent than in the evening, typically. Before you eat, more sensitive than after you eat. Before, lots of coffee, then after, lots of coffee. And so there's all kinds of variance that is really interesting from the diagnostic point of view and a health point of view, but it's true. So there's a real personal variation and a variation between people. Now, that said, when it comes to major markers of scent, you generally smell chocolate like I smell chocolate. I mean, there's some basic categories of scent that are pretty universally smelled in a similar way. The issue of scent, another issue of scent, is you saturate after a certain amount of time. Your nose, you no longer smell it, right? It's like coming in this room, turn on the lights, 8 minutes later you don't see anything. And so scent saturates, and so it gets to the headache thing too, if there's too long on the receptors. And so one of the things is that the way we deliver scent right now, it's like we produce it, and then it just hangs around, right? And so this long duration of scent is your nose is not prepared for it, which is why in eating, going from many different courses in a short period of time is good for you, keeping your sensory sensitivity high. So you need to vary scent over time, really every few minutes, to kind of keep aware of it. And it is true that, getting back to this composition issue, that there are some molecules that you're sensitive to at 10 to the minus 5 concentration, and others 10 to the minus 12. Like, there's a huge variation. And so depending upon what you've put into that scent, you could way overstimulate a person's nose by putting in the wrong thing. And so I think from a design of nature point of view, I think we're still in early stages there. So yeah, I think that's true.
But how do you work with it in the exhibition? I mean, because how do you control?
Well, so we work. Yeah, so we work a lot. We were working with thousands of people. Actually, so we've got what we. So we do major testing with people, and we have, so in our scent cartridge, I can show you later, we have a sustained release gel, which is releasing scent at a very small, so these are very small amounts, and they last for 2 months because we just put a very little bit in the air. And so we, and then you blow a little air through the right scent, chestnut or whatever. But if I do it here, you don't smell it here, and he doesn't smell it here. It's actually very, very personal. Once you put too much in the air, it's then mixes, and you can't get rid of it. So the key to this, to making scent behave like light, is to make just enough, but not too much. And so sometimes you may not actually be aware of it. And so we, then we do lots of tests, basically. Yeah, I can tell you more.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So, thank you. My question is that, in my opinion, there is one of the major problems in cooperations of science and art is that such projects often lead to a kind of eventization or aestheticization of research or of knowledge. So I think it's very difficult to find strategies to make the event character of such kind of research that leads to more sustainability or to a longer impact of knowledge, not only for the moment of the event or the interaction between scientists and people and community, etc. So what do you think about this?
I think that's true. I think it's true. But so I'm going to, so I think that once you step away from this urgent, sort of desperate space that is a frontier, where we're all kind of afraid and we're all not really sure what tomorrow brings, then the boundaries between science and art become pretty tall, and the mixing of science and art becomes often pretty pathological, and you're kind of making science not science and art not art often. I mean, when you're at the frontier, so if you take, we can take a few of the examples that I'm making, the jellyfish example, for example. So Lisa's doing science and also writing about this issue, which is we kind of don't have enough data for her to kind of be, and actually to have the idea in the public domain, and not as this is true and this is false, but actually in an artistic form, so there's a public dialogue around an issue which, ultimately it's related to resources for her work, it's related to the public understanding. So I think more frequently than not today at frontiers, because they matter so much to the world, scientists' work is limited by not having a public dialogue. And the public dialogue cannot be, I'm going to tell you what it is. It's got to be, artists come and make whatever you want of it. I'm in a dialogue, and it's like, and so for artists it's fascinating. And they do whatever the hell they want from an artistic point of view. And it leads to, it's a long-term dialogue, but I think that the value of that is increasingly recognized today and at frontiers. But if I could say, I think that there's a whole area of sci art and which is much more there's some fascinating work going on, but it has not really, I think some of these issues about, well, how does it help science or art, how is it really valid, basically. So.
But do you have any experience what happens in science after this dialogue is over?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So there are, this is again a long issue here, but let me say in general, I would say the biggest benefit that scientists get from this kind of an interaction is it's really refreshing. So one of the challenges of doing anything well is that you actually become prisoner of your success, and you're kind of now managing this thing, and all the kind of the passion and the kind of that led you to go into this in the first place is kind of gone because you've got the whole team that you're kind of driving down the track. And so the idea of stepping away, having a completely new view of things, and having somebody who's very much not like you. I mean, one of the other big problems of being successful, everybody kind of thinks like you, right? Unless you get to do a debate or whatever. But now having a very different culture, which has anyway, so it's very refreshing, I think, and I could give you lots of examples. There are some cases where you can really trace, oh, wow, because of that they made a real innovation, and you mentioned the Wyss Institute, and the director of the Wyss Institute, Don Ingber, developed a theory of cellular structure, which is called tensegrity, which is based upon a Buckminster Fuller encounter back when he was at Yale University. And again, he pursued this idea, cells have this sort of Buckminster Fuller structure, and everybody laughed at him and said, you're totally nuts. And he ultimately was able to confirm it, but it was this big leap he made. And there's books have been written on the fact that big leaps in science and art can often be traced to encounters, sometimes really direct, Kepler kind of encounters, and sometimes more indirect. But you can't ask that to happen, right? I think the main thing is that people just, wow, it's just really a great experience. I think.
All right. Any other questions? But we are coming, I think, now to an end for now.
Okay.
So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.